Grab your pitchforks and rotten fruit. You're entering the show that encourages dangerous discussions with God's holy book. I'm your host, Ryan White, and this is Conversations with the Bible. Politics and religion, two things that should never be mixed together and never should be discussed at work, right? Or maybe not. This episode, Dr. Dinah Dye and I are going to be talking about should the Bible guide us in politics? Is God political? Was Yeshua a political figure? What does that mean? How do we navigate life? What things can we do? And of course, should we vote? Welcome everyone to another Conversations with the Bible podcast. I'm Ryan White, your host, and this week we were going to actually do one. I told you guys last time we were going to do one on speaking, but what we want to do this week is instead kind of shift gears just because of some stuff that's happened in my, I don't want to call it public life because I don't really consider Facebook to be public, maybe semi-public life, with some discussions about politics and the Bible. And as soon as politics kind of came up and had a little bit of pushback against that, I thought of none other than my good friend, Dr. Dinah Dye, who's just put out this wonderful video on Bonhoeffer and has some really great insight into how we as believers in the God of Israel and modern day Americans, how we make that work out with all the political nonsense going on. So welcome to the show, Dinah.
Well, thanks, Ryan. Great topic. Thanks for inviting me. We could talk about this till the cows come home. And I think it's just one of the most essential topics right now. And so hopefully we can answer people's questions and concerns about this particular area.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that as we get into more and more trouble in this nation, this is going to be something that really reaches out and speaks to people and gets people interested in God, because as we start to see political unrest and things just go crazy, people stop having their heads in books and movies and everything like that, and they start to actually pay attention to what's going on in the real world. And I don't know how you feel about this, but I kind of feel that Christianity and the messianic, whatever you want to call yourself, world has we've kind of gone off into our own thing. Right? Instead of going into Hollywood movies, it's all these discussions about theology, about the shape of the earth, and all sorts of things. And even in our serious and good discussions about the Bible, I feel like oftentimes we forget that we actually live in a real world with real people out there. Do you ever get that?
I think that's a good point. Yeah, I talk with people about that all the time. I think there's a real hunger now for relevance and to make sense of the world around us. Unfortunately, we have really in the last couple of 100 years, because we entered into this world of desiring to escape the problems, I've shared in when I've gone to conferences, this head for the hills mentality has done us a great disservice and caused us to sort of exit stage left out of the culture and out of the political arena as well. And I think it's problematic. And what I noticed at some of these conferences as I've been taking this on and talking about it in real terms, it's been the young people that have really responded. I've had a lot of sort of late teens, early 20s come up to me and thank me for sharing, because in this movement, messianic movement, et cetera, no one's addressing it. And they're trying to make sense of their world because they're, in it. Yeah. So I hope with this discussion, we can talk about it's, our world matters. We're physical people. We live in a physical world. How do we deal with the world in which we live?
Yeah, absolutely. As you're mentioning that, I'm just sitting there thinking, this flee for the hills mentality, the only place I can really see that is in biblical times. It seems like is the Qumran community. I mean, you had a
True.
couple little instances here and there, Elijah on the mountain and stuff like that. But at the same time, he spent most of his time in society, pushing back against the politics of his days.
Exactly right. I think one of the other areas that is problematic in our studies is that we don't understand kingship and kingdom.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look at if you were honest and looked at the Bible, you would realize that every single book of the Bible is dealing with politics.
Yeah.
So when you go into Genesis and Exodus, you're dealing with Egypt and Pharaoh and the environment of Israel in the nations. When you look at the Kings, Samuel, Judges, Chronicles, it's all about kingship. And Proverbs and Psalms is how the kings rule. You look at the prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. Now you're dealing with the backdrop of the Assyrians, the Babylonians, with Daniel, the Persians. You're dealing with the north and southern tribe splitting, the kingdom, the kingship. You get into the time of Yeshua, first century. Now we're dealing with Rome. Everything is in the backdrop of the nations and of kingdoms and empires. And so the reality is, how does Israel function with that as the backdrop?
Mm. Yeah, and to get a little bit more into Yeshua, because this was the issue I ran into this week for our viewers out there. You and I talked about this a little bit. Was that I put out a video, and I was just talking about how the feeding of the 5,000, that feeding people is a very political act. Feeding a massive amount of people, you're taking away the government's authority over them, and so of course,
and that was the king's domain, and it was his responsibility to grow food for the empire from his garden. So now Yeshua is out; he's taken that authority away from the king.
Yeah, I don't think a lot of people realize this. Most of the food in the first century world came from Egypt. Actually, that a lot of them weren't growing their own food for their own communities. The Romans owned the land, and they would grow their cash crops like grapes for wine and olives for oil, because that was the cash crop. And most of the food actually came from Egypt, and the Romans would ship it in to places.
That's right,
like Judea.
And that's what we have in Revelation when it talks about a loaf of bread for a day's wages. We go into about the mid-40s of the Common Era. We'll find that there was a huge problem in Egypt. They were in a drought famine situation, so they were unable to ship large quantities of wheat to the land to feed the people. So we've got this serious famine situation caused by Egypt itself.
Yeah, and I mean that's a whole nother podcast in of itself, just showing how the evils of empire, how Rome, because of their pursuit of profit, had set up this economic system that was set up for failure when that one little cog in the wheel goes down.
Yeah, and so this is true from the beginning of time. We're dealing with large-scale growing of food, feeding the population, going back into ancient Sumer, and all their city-states were set up that way. Food, trading food and providing for large quantities of wheat. That takes us back to the very beginning. So this should be no surprise.
Yeah. And so anyway, someone, with this podcast, or with this, it was a Facebook Live video I did, someone took issue and said, oh, well, Jesus isn't political, and how dare you say he was political, and you're just trying to push your own personal agenda. And I will say I'm not pushing, you to vote Democrat or Republican. But I do think that, and I don't think that the Bible says that one side or the other is great, but the Bible does call us to be involved within politics in the nation, especially when we're calling out evil.
Right.
When we're standing up to it.
Well, think about what Yeshua did. His whole ministry was, he's either dealing with the temple leadership, which was very much political at that time, or
political.
He's dealing with the Herod the Herod sons who were ruling at the time, or he's dealing with Rome. Almost everything he's saying and doing is a pushback. When you think about him going and overturning the tables, that was a huge pushback against the political leadership of the temple, because they didn't even have the right, high priest in there. They were, the temple was the center of commercial and commerce, economics, etc. Mm-hmm. So he was going into that territory and pushing back. He always did that. But of course, he's presenting a kingdom, because they understood kingdom, that functioned exactly 180 degrees opposite of how the kingdoms of this world function.
Yeah.
And that's how he pushed back.
Well, and that's the more I've been reading the Gospels, the more I've realized how true this is, and how many of us have not actually been taught what the kingdom of God is about. Because, you go out there and you say Yeshua is king, and immediately you're going to get pushback. Well, if he's king, why are there other nations? And why is there this? And why is there that? Why are there all these bad things happening in the world? But if you look at his parables, if you look at what he says, his idea of kingdom, God's type of kingdom, is not what we think of as kingdom. It's not about coming and forcing other people into subjection to you.
Right, because that's the nature of the kingdoms of this world. They always did. They were tyrants. Mm-hmm. And so they oppressed and enslaved and controlled. And so, he's showing this kingdom operates in the opposite way. There's only two kingdoms here. Yeah. And I don't know if we want to talk about, even going back to the beginning, to the ancient mind, the cosmos was a kingdom, and it operated like a kingdom, and it had a king. And so everything was patterned after that. And the people in the ancient world understood this. So, we talk today about heaven, and we look at it as this place up in the sky, or outside of time, or it's this sort of alternate universe. But in their world, they simply use that word, heaven, to describe the domain of the kings. Mm-hmm. That was where they lived and ruled and functioned from. And then the domain of men was, the domain of the earth was where men lived. So the goal of the king, after he had defeated his enemies and took his seat on the throne, was to unite those two spheres, heaven and earth. So we have this sort of. So go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, and the king was considered to be like the palace or whatever was essentially considered like a part of heaven almost. It was. Yeah, you see this. I was reading a book, God and Empire, by John Dominic Crossan the other day, and he just has these just amazing examples of things attributed to Augustus Caesar, and you see, exactly what you're saying there. Heaven was not some place that you have to get to in a spaceship.
Right.
Caesar was from heaven, and he ruled from heaven in their world view.
Exactly right. So the temple was actually synonymous with heaven. When one entered into the temple, it was as though one entered into heaven. But you could only go, that was the only place you could see the king or approach the king or visit the king or whatever, was in, quote, the temple where he sat on the throne. So one of the statements I make quite a bit is, in the first century, imagine. So there's Caesar, he's seated on the throne in heaven from Rome. You look at the temple, how it's operated, the high priest, of course, in the Holy of Holies. And then you have Yeshua, who is the King of Kings, walking around among the folks. There's no way in any empire that any king would ever come out of his world, heaven, and walk, on earth amongst the people, if you will.
Yeah.
So what Yeshua did was 180 degrees out of phase whatever any other king would have done. This would have been unbelievable, really.
Yeah. Yeah, and that right there is just an amazing example of how it's that 180 degree different, that upside down kingdom, where it's not about domination, it's about service and love. And that's exactly what you see. This king, I never thought about that, but the king is walking around among the common people, which they were not used to, and he's actually, he's going as far as to washing their feet.
Exactly. You couldn't get any farther from the king if you tried. So again, if we don't look at the context of it, it's sort of difficult to recognize what's going on. And so, of course, we have with the Beatitudes, everything functions opposite of how the kingdoms of this world function. But they're here and they function that way. So one of the ways we push back as part of the faith community is to act oppositely of what tyrants do, not out of arrogance and control and enslavement.
And the word for that I've been really on a push with, I know some people aren't even familiar with the concept here. It's called being subversive.
Okay.
Subversive is this idea of, basically exactly what you said, that you're doing through your actions. It's nonviolent resistance, if you will. Here we go. I'm going to pull up, because I like the Wikipedia definition here. I'm just going to read this real quick. It says it refers to a process by which the values and principles of a system in place are contradicted or reversed in an attempt to transform the established social order and its structures of power, authority, hierarchy, and social norms. Like, that's good. That right there is the gospel, is what Yeshua is doing in the gospel message. I agree. He's rather than trying to, attack with force, he's subverting, he's trying to transform social order. And that's the message. Key. That's key right there, because tyrants, what they do, they create chaos by the way they design, if you will, social order. And so what he's basically doing is creating order out of the chaos that the tyrants are, So when a tyrant or a king, whatever, comes to power, and he has the choice to exercise wisdom and good policy or bad policy. So what we see with these tyrants is they exercise bad policy, which then, extend their power and control over the people and enslave their citizens. They become autocrats and oppressed. Yeah. They become, in essence, the political or the ruling class. And again, they create chaos by those policies. And so then we look at the kingdom of heaven. The principles and concepts of the kingdom of heaven produce order and peace and what we call shalom and rest. Yeah. And that is what the king is supposed to manifest in his empire. Mm. That really just got me thinking on something there. Because so when these tyrants, whether that's an individual or a political party, when they bring these things out, oftentimes they are disguised in the most beautiful propaganda you can imagine. Exactly. You think about the modern push for abortion is wrapped up in the package of women's rights, right? Who wouldn't want women's rights after we have in our history, of oppressing women? And so they take these things and they just put the spin on them. And Yeshua, he presents stuff that does not sound appealing at all. Like, if you want to be the greatest, become someone's servant. Like, I don't want to be someone's servant. you know? And yet in those things, we as we study these out, and this is the beauty for me of studying scripture, is as we study these things out, we see, even though that doesn't look good, even though that doesn't make sense, and that's why Yeshua's kingdom is such a 180 kingdom, because it doesn't make sense. It's illogical. Yes. That he could have defeated death by allowing himself to be crucified. Exactly. You can't get, what tyrant is going to allow himself to be crucified and gain, power, if you will. And yet we see 2,000 years later what a profound effect one crucifixion has had on the entire world. No, it's exactly right. And so, it does become frustrating when people have marginalized what the bottom line message is of the gospel and the kingdom. And as you said, this is an area we're sorely lacking in education. And the problem is we have put all of this into this sort of spiritual box Mm-hmm.
And, we've got the spiritual box, and then we got the, natural box, if you will.
Yeah.
And we can't seem to reconcile the two. And so, all kinds of things. And then we get into arguments and debates over it. But I would say, God, and this is, we're going to talk a little bit about what's going on in our country, but
Absolutely.
the Father has called us to it. So in the ancient world, or whatever world you want to talk about, I mean, when a king, a tyrant, or whatever comes to power, he has to continually feed off that power. So that means he has to extend the land, the empire, his power base, and he does that by killing, destroying, raping, pillaging, plundering.
Mm-hmm.
So and then we see Yeshua. We're expanding territory in the same way a kingdom is supposed to be expanded, in the opposite way. By love and by extending mercy and compassion, and by taking care of the poor and the downtrodden. But we're in essence doing the same thing. We're expanding territory because the nature of every kingdom is to take as much territory as possible.
Yeah. And that's where we get into so much trouble when we fail to realize that the kingdom is here on earth and is now. It's not some, obviously there is a fullness in the future, but Yeshua didn't come and say, the kingdom that's going to be in heaven in 2,000 years. He's, even in the, if hopefully, we're praying the Lord's Prayer on at least a daily basis. Your kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven, not your kingdom come in heaven so that we can go there.
Right, exactly. Well, and again, if we recognize that was the role of the king, was to unite heaven and earth. That was, when he sat on the throne, that's how they thought of what he was doing. But as I said, in the ancient world, the king never left heaven, unless he was kicked out. So the language we see in Scripture, when we see stars, falling, and we see, anything sort of cataclysmic in the heavens kind of coming down or being cast out, is not, we can't take that literally as, we're just waiting for shooting stars to come and sort of envelop the world. That's speaking of bringing down the empire, the king. I think it's Isaiah 14 that talks, we've always translated it as Lucifer, the bright shining star that's cast out of heaven.
Yeah.
But that's just basically speaking of King Nebuchadnezzar being taken down. So a lot of that language, which we interpret in a very sort of spiritual, esoteric way, is really dealing with a physical reality of that time, because once again, the king's domain was heaven. So Revelation, for example, we see that the dragon, the serpent, being cast out, right, of heaven, which is probably dealing with Caesar, probably Nero, can't say 100%, but of him being taken down. So, we just keep, I think where I'm coming from at this, I'm trying to figure out how can we just be practical about the world that we live in, and what can we do to make it better? That's our role, that's what it comes down to for me.
Yeah. And I think that's so key. And I don't know that, we're going to have the answers for everyone right here and now. But when we need to start the process going down that path. What does the Bible actually say about not our future, but today? Like, how do I deal with today? How do I deal with the things going on in this country? And we've since probably since the start of like Hal Lindsey and all of his type with the rapture theory, it's just this mentality of, well, we're going to escape. And so the worse it gets, the better it is for us, because that just means we're closer to our escape. And I just don't see that in the Bible. Then, I don't see them saying, pray for the world to go to hell in a handbasket, because then you're going to be saved.
Well, and then we are totally abdicating our responsibility as kingdom citizens to expand the kingdom. And expanding the kingdom means bringing that message to people that are being held captive by addictions and myriads of addictions.
Yeah.
We're basically saying, too bad for you. You'll just remain enslaved while I get out of Dodge. So we are completely violating the major tenet of the kingdom, to rescue those who've been held captive and to set the captives free.
Yeah, and I would add to that, to rescue them doesn't mean save souls for heaven. It doesn't mean that they say the sinner's prayer or get saved or anything. It's talking about rescuing them from their addiction so that they can actually get back to life right now. They can function. Yeah,
exactly. And as we see our world, it's spinning out of control and out of chaos. And I would maintain because of bad leadership and implementing policies that violate the very heart and nature of God. But the addiction level has intensified to such a degree. It feels like it's just swirling out of control. And you look at it, you throw up your hands and go, oh my, how am I going to deal with this? Well, we deal with it one person at a time. Whether in your family or in your immediate community, how can you rescue those people being held captive by that tyrant, addiction that's oppressing them? That's our job. We have the message. Anyone who actually had a transformational, experience with Messiah Yeshua knows that he is more than able to deliver and set free. And on that basis, we need to go out and take that message, out into the highways and the byways.
Oh, absolutely. I work in an intensive care unit, and we see it all the time. It's, and I will admit I've been in the wrong about dealing with it. I'm like, my mindset was, well, these people are just losers. They're just they got themselves into trouble, and I think that's kind of been the mentality that's been pushed in at least certain sectors. But I'll tell you,
I think we're all guilty of that.
Well, good. It's good to know that I'm not the only one.
No, you're not the only one.
And as having done some drugs in high school and stuff, I understand the social pressures and stuff, but it was still, I didn't get into it other than just a little bit of high school experimentation. But I was always judgmental, but you talk about these people being enslaved and this being something. I had this patient. It wasn't my patient, but I was the charge nurse, and I was kind of coming around, and this patient just lost it. He'd been on some sort of drugs, and he'd been on a ventilator, a breathing machine, and then he'd pulled his own tube out, and they'd kind of left him alone. And then he just after the drugs we'd been using to sedate him wore off, he just lost it. And I'm not kidding you. There was 3 male nurses on him and between 6 and 8 security guards trying to hold this guy down while he's in restraints. This stuff gives you superhuman strength when you're like this.
Yes.
And I don't think I'll ever forget it. He's screaming, "Stop trying to kill me. You're drowning me. You're drowning me."
Wow.
This guy was scared out of his mind by this drug, these drugs, this addiction. And I think, I was already moving down the path towards this, but that right there just kind of stuck in my mind, man. These people are enslaved. Whatever the reason that they got into it really is irrelevant. Whether it was their choice or whether it was peer pressure or whatever the case may be, that's irrelevant when it comes to rescuing them.
Exactly. And, I don't want to get into all of that. One of the things I share with my teams, we'll get a chance maybe to talk a little bit about On Fire, is we have to look at what's going on the other side. There's no question, the radical left, progressive left are militants. And the reality is that they are totalitarian in nature, which basically means, the state legislating what you say, think, and do. But how do we, and the things they're doing, obviously none of us would agree with. But the reality is, if we look at the person, the activist, what's going on in their life that is driving them to this militant behavior and wanting to crush, people that oppose them, and in particular, Christians and Jews. And I maintain these people are just broken, and because of that, addicted to whatever. And they're, in essence, trying to cover up their shame, their guilt, all of the stuff, the bitterness, the resentment, whatever you want to call it. And so they're functioning also out of that place of just being held captive and enslaved. And if we can try to look at them as people in that, that they are slaves to sin, if you will, perhaps maybe we can have more compassion and begin to pray for them, because they need to be delivered and set free. Yeah. Because if they are, they're going to end up thinking like kingdom people and extending compassion and mercy. So that, even though we fight out, in the marketplace for the value of life, we're still dealing with human beings that are held captive to a tyrant. The tyrant being, I don't know, whatever you want to call the tyrant. the addiction tyrant. Yeah, there you go. But all those people, think about their lives. I mean, what has gone on in their lives to bring them to that point?
Yeah. Yeah. And that's so important for us to do, because one of the things that brings them to the point where they're crying out for, being pro-abortion, not even just pro-abortion, but celebrating abortion, is that they have taken a people group and ascribed to them being less than human.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And we have to be on guard against that, because what happens when we start to think of these people who have this horrible ideology, and we start to think, because I know I've been guilty of this, we start to think of them as less than human. That these people
absolutely.
We're going to fall into that same
You should see me in front of my TV. Yeah, I mean, and that's the thing. We cannot lose our humanity. I mean, we saw that happen in World War II, pre World War II Germany. The people lost their humanity, and you're dead if that happens.
Yeah.
And anything can happen if that's the place you find yourself. And so, it requires a disciplined life with a focus on God. It's not easy, but that's the goal of the other side, the tyrant side, is to take away your humanity, I believe.
And this is an area that you get into a lot in your new Bonhoeffer DVD.
Yeah. So, I just felt it was time. I had studied and read about Bonhoeffer for years. I basically used some of the material from Eric Metaxas book, Prophet, Martyr, Spy, something, Pastor. I got it in the wrong order. But, and because this is a man who dove right into the center of this totalitarianism and tried to figure out how do you deal with it. I mean, we need to know how to deal with what we're dealing with. But the message, I talk a lot about how he wrestled with this. He ended up joining the Abwehr, which is a German military intelligence, working from inside to subvert, if you will, the Nazi regime. He helped Jews escape. He was trying to get messages through to the Allies about what was going on. He was part of the plot, the Valkyrie, to assassinate Hitler. And yet he was trying to find the role of the church. What is the role of the church here? When do we push back? How do we push back? He just wrestled with all these things, and I think all of us are going to have to wrestle with the very same issues. But it always came down to the role of the church was to help the state be the state, to let the state know when it had pushed past its proper boundaries, and that the church was always responsible to speak on behalf of those who had no voice, whether they were in the community or not. It didn't matter. Those that could not speak for themselves, those that were being, tormented, persecuted, etc., which is why he was so adamant about, speaking out on behalf of the Jews. He was the one who coined silence in the face of evil is itself evil. And that not to speak is to speak, or not to act is to act. These were things that he he wrote about. And, in the end, he was hung 2 weeks before the Allies came. And yet I marvel because this is, 75 years now, and yet his message is more important and more relevant now to me than it was. So I ended up recording this 9-part series about his life and just going through all these various aspects and doing some teaching, etc. And so we're promoting it. You can just go to bonhoefferdvd.com. And we're very excited because we were able to get the series into the hands of some pretty amazing people. Now, I don't know that necessarily means anything.
Yeah.
But we Donald Trump Jr. has it. Charlie Kirk, Bridget Gabriel has it. We were able to give it to Will over at Prager University. Nice. And another young man who has something called First Priority, which is they're in the schools. It was birthed after Columbine. So
okay.
Like I said, this is in the hands of the Lord. I have no clue, but it's an important message for this time, and hopefully will help people understand what we're facing and what's going on.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, for those of you who don't know, I've been producing this for you, and I've kind of caught little bits and pieces, but I've had so much going on in my life these last couple of weeks, I just haven't had time to sit down and watch it. But from what I've seen, it's an awesome teaching. It's amazing teaching. And it actually, even without having sit down and watch the whole thing, you kind of inspired me to do that Facebook Live video I did on the politics that Yeshua was involved in. And sometimes as teachers, we kind of stop talking about subjects because we get beat down by people. And this was kind of one of those areas I've just had, just the naysayers, that vocal minority, just just kind of beats you down. So the whole idea of just getting into the political side, I just like, I know it's important, but I don't want the headaches. But seeing how amazing of a job you did there, and having listened to a little bit of it, it kind of hit me. You know what? Sometimes we've just got to say it. It's worth the headache, because this is something that we need.
I mean, we are in huge trouble, but I do see people starting to push back. For example, we had that woman on the soccer team when they were forcing them to wear, the homosexual gender colored thing. I refuse. That's another area people need. I am not going to call it what they call it, because they win every time we use their terms. Yeah. And this is one little way I can push back. Mm-hmm. So instead of calling it gay, I'm calling it homosexual, because that's exactly what it is. And that's just a little tip. And so, she refused, and she essentially lost her spot on the women's soccer team. Like, she gave up everything. I mean, she worked her whole life for this, and she gave that up. We had another example, even yesterday, I think, of a beauty queen at the, Miss International, whatever. Mm-hmm. They were trying to force her to put a hijab on. And she was crowned. They took away her crown because of, quote, insensitive remarks on her Facebook, which weren't the least bit insensitive, and because she wouldn't put this hijab on that they were trying to force her to put on. And she lost her crown. These are examples to us of people who've given up. And these are young people. I mean, we should just be in awe. These are young people that are doing this because they have determined that their faith in Messiah, Yeshua, and their walk in the kingdom is of more value than what these people are making them do. Yeah. So we're starting to see some pushback, which that's what it's going to take. We can't just give in. And I would just encourage you, because I was just at Revive, and I was also at the Love for Israel conference, and I did not hold back. I just shared lots of what we're talking about here. And I'm sure there were people that were offended, but I'm telling you, the large majority of people came up and thanked me for the message. that
Nice.
they are inspired and ready to hear. And we cannot worry about those naysayers and people who don't get it.
Yeah.
I just feel with every last breath I have, I'm going to share. Now, I try to balance it, of course, with the teaching from the scripture. I don't want to go off half-baked here.
Yeah.
And I'm not running for office. God has not called me to do that. But this is an important message. And I mean, how would you like to leave a legacy like Bonhoeffer, where 75 years later, people are reading your writings and going, oh my gosh, this is what we're going to need to get through what we're going through. That's amazing.
And I don't think this is something that you can have one little proof text for, but I mean, it as we kind of talked about, I mean, it's all over the place. You look at the prophets. The prophets weren't running around to like individual synagogues and, giving them a word from the Lord. They were going to the king. They were going to the king's courts. This was them influencing politics. This was them trying to change the nation. And Yeshua, one of his primary roles was a prophet.
I agree.
So we can't disregard, if we're supposed to follow him, if we're supposed to do what he does, we're supposed to have a voice in the king's court. We're supposed to be saying, this is wrong. This doesn't mean, like you said, this doesn't mean we have to go out and run for political office. If that's what you're called to do, that's wonderful. But we're also called to hold people accountable. And as you mentioned with that female soccer player, terminology is so vital. Naming things has such power.
Yeah.
That's one of these things. I never really understood the power of naming things until someone just pointed it out, and it's like it's really, really powerful. You think about here's my I'm gonna give away my big example as I'm gonna use in some upcoming teaching one day.
Okay.
You think about this, my wife, and I'm sure a lot of women are like this. Your child has this red rash on their skin, right? And so the mother, of course, freaks out. This child's gonna die, something like that, and so she rushes them to the doctor. The doctor comes in and sees it, looks at it, kind of pokes and prods a little bit, and then declares your child has dermatitis. And and immediately the mother is so relieved.
Yes, it has a name.
Yeah, exactly. It has a name. And by the way, dermatitis literally means inflammation of the skin.
Right.
Like, he didn't tell you anything you didn't already know. All he did was give it a name, and that name has the power to calm you down.
Well, and isn't that true? I mean, the ancient world, that was everything. Because when you named something, you brought something literally into existence that wasn't in existence.
Yeah.
So you gave it existence, you gave it life, you gave it power to function in the world that it was designed to function.
Yeah.
And when something didn't have a name or didn't have an identity, like you think of the northern tribes being hauled off into exile and losing identity and name, like that was the worst thing that could happen in that culture. And, you're the honor shame guy, so full well the shame that brought. So, that's what I am all about, calling it what it is.
Yeah.
Do not let them take control of the language.
And I think that's a piece of very practical advice for people today. I mean, that's one realm that you can influence and that you can control. Don't allow it to be called women's rights. Call it out. It is abortion. It is murder.
Right.
Other social issues. Call it like it is. Don't let them influence you by naming it something else and then you attaching it. And beyond that, I mean, we should also be trying to come up with these clever terms to really expose. I mean, that's one of the ways of exposing things is by giving it a name. John's Revelation, John's Apocalypse, right? He calls out Caesar as the dragon.
Right.
People thought of him as Lord, God, Savior of the world, and he says, no, you're a dragon. And by putting that name on him, that naming has power there.
It really does. I mean, I think that's a great thing. I mean, if we can come up with a way to call it as it is, instead of what they have named it, that will take away some of the power.
Yeah.
There's no question about it. And I just the other thing I wanted to just mention while we're doing this is, in light of all that I've been doing, we put together what we call On Fire Prayer. And we have 175 prayer team leaders in 42 states and 7 countries. And basically, I send out texts Friday afternoon and Saturday evening. The Friday afternoon texts go to the team leaders. It's some inspiration for the Shabbat to kind of check out of reality, close your screens, get with God. And then Saturday night, I send out texts with the prayer needs for the week. So, for example, this week I sent out, we are dealing with the big cartels, the big tech companies, and the amount of influence and control that they have over, they are very totalitarian in nature. So there's a call this week, because they are bent on taking control over the election 2020. So each week I sort of feature some particular thing. And we have the states all divided up through the days of the week, so every state has a different day to pray. And we're just trying to build, our network and our prayer teams and encourage our leaders, because you can't do anything if you don't start with prayer. But the point of this is, we call it the On Fire Prayer Initiative, because it's not just about praying, it's about doing. Yeah. And actually, I just did a post yesterday on Facebook. Really, almost the doing comes down to the being, and so, to be the light, to be the person God's called you to be, and to be all these, to be shrewd and sensible, and to be persevering, and to be consistent, and to, just had a whole list of things to be, because that's who you're going to take out into the marketplace. And that's where the power lies, in your being a kingdom citizen and pushing out the kingdom. So that's kind of it in a nutshell.
So what inspired you to start that?
Pure and unadulterated fear. I don't want to go into the whole story, but in February, our legislature was meeting here in New Mexico. And I watched in 4 weeks, because we have a supermajority of Democrats here in New Mexico, the congressional delegation, as well as the state house and the governorship. And in 4 weeks, they basically destroyed our state, passed 300 bills, none of them good for the state. This is a very poor state. So, and I'm not going to go into all the different bills, but I just went, what just happened? And it's so... it got me going. I started writing letters and calling, and, I wrote all these different senators and state house people, and they would respond with just stupid stuff. I'm going, what on earth have we got going on up there? And I realized, that just sort of sitting around and hoping and wishing and, oh, God's got it all in control, He's going to work it all out, was not going to, that thinking was over.
Yeah.
And so it just motivated me to get active, starting from my state. But then I realized all the states were having the same issues. And these abortion bills that were being passed, starting, actually New Mexico and New York. So I was just, I have to say, I was scared to death what's going to happen, to my kids and my grandkids. And I realized that I just had really been doing nothing. Here and there, and, I study the Bible, I write books, I try to encourage, but I just felt our nation matters to me. I love this country, and we have been given the greatest gift of mankind, and that is the ability to vote and to determine our destiny. Yeah. And here I was not even, I always vote, but I just wasn't serious about it. And you and I know, we have studied these ancient empires. Who on earth would ever want to live in ancient Rome as a slave, or Babylon or Assyria? Yeah. Oh my gosh. And here we have the freedom to determine our destiny by who we elect. I mean, this is sobering and profound, and as I said, the greatest gift given to mankind. So
Yeah,
I don't want to waste that.
and unfortunately, a lot of times we just spend time complaining about how bad it is, and you're actually getting out there
Exactly.
and doing something. And I mean, that's um, that's just a great example of how you don't have to have political connections. You don't, we all have the ability to do something.
And that's absolutely the truth. I mean, the concept of one person can make a difference is absolutely, it's amazing that one person can make a difference, but you can.
Yeah.
And I want to encourage people. And that's why I've chosen somebody like Bonhoeffer. And there's, myriads of people in history. I think of William Wilberforce and the slave trade. There's, they're one person, but they managed to turn the tide. Mm-hmm. So imagine if all of us go out there and be that one person.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and that's the thing is that as individuals, we can only go so far, but if we can get a ball rolling and get more people on board, more people fired up for understanding what the gospel is actually about, that there is a calling, that there's a role, that we are called to make the world a better place. We're not supposed to just be sitting around. The more people doing this, the more people saying this, maybe for whoever you are out there listening, maybe you personally can't get something big rolling, but maybe your word to someone else who has connections gets that ball rolling.
Absolutely. Well, look what just happened with Netflix, right? And they were going to get the ACLU and, sue the state of Georgia for the fetal heart life bill. And they just lost 126,000 subscribers.
Yeah.
I mean, their stock's down in the tank. And that whoever said, I am not supporting this company. Now, I realize if we really follow through, there'll probably never be any place for us to eat. But, you got to start somewhere. And that's one way to hold these companies accountable. Just don't invest in them in any way. And so it made a difference. It made a difference.
Yep. And now for the hard question.
Uh-oh.
Because that just reminded me of, because you made the comment, well, where do we, we're not going to be able to eat anywhere. That's kind of the thing is that I don't, outside of a couple companies, I don't know that there are any moral companies out there.
There aren't. I think you have to just pick your battles.
Yeah.
So we bailed out of Netflix about a year ago because I was mad that, they brought on Susan Rice and Obama.
Yeah.
And I was just, and it's just filth that's coming out of that screen. So obviously, we have to be able to go shop. I get that. But I think you pick those things that are near and dear to your heart and you follow through. So, for instance, when Target started doing all that business with the gender changing rooms and stuff, we just said, that's it. We're done with Target. We made a statement. Obviously, some people went back to Target. We did not. We refused. We have not shopped there since that day. Mm-hmm. We don't. Starbucks is another one for us. We've never shopped. We've never gone to Starbucks since he came out with his anti-Israel stuff. So I recognize it's not possible, but you just need to pick those things that are close to you and determine that you are not going to go back when it's convenient or inconvenient, I should say, that you need something.
Yeah.
You got to figure that out. So that's my best advice on that.
So what about voting? Because I think this is something that I know I've seen it come up a lot, and I know it's a question that gets asked frequently. Is how can here's the question I see the way I see it phrased most frequently. How can a Christian vote for a man like Donald Trump? We're talking 2016 election.
Well, and I would readily admit in the primaries.
And I will say I voted for him.
All on board. Yes, I voted for him too. My husband was all on board from the beginning because he didn't really care about. We weren't voting for Mr. Moral in Chief.
Yeah.
We were picking, this is how I operate, because for me, the most important position is life.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where I start. I probably have to hold my nose for some of the other areas, but my feeling is if this person holds life as sacred and, is pro-life, then I think some of the other things will fall into place. And we knew for sure, that Trump was pro-life, and there were several other areas, but that was really the main thing for me. And I guess I have to say, in his case, just to see someone actually, a president, push back against the media, against Congress, against the culture,
mm-hmm.
was so outside the box. It endeared. He was endeared to me. Yeah. But again, my first is and I don't know what I will do. I mean, I readily admit when I'm faced with two people running for an office and neither of them are pro-life.
Yeah.
I have not run into that yet. And that day is coming as sure as, So then what do I do?
Mm-hmm.
And I guess that's when you say maybe I'm the one that's supposed to run for office, or we have to start working on, at the precinct level, trying to get people to run who are pro-life. And I just think all of the other issues will fall into place if someone values life above all else. And that's just me. That's how I operate.
Yeah, I think that's an amazing answer to, because I mean, ultimately life is key.
Mm-hmm.
You look at the great people in the Bible, and a lot of them didn't have good morals either. I mean, King David,
right?
I mean, he was quite a womanizer too.
One of the things that people complain about the founding fathers and whatever else they complain about, and I say, well, were they perfect? And they go, well, no. Are the people in office now perfect? Well, no. Are you perfect? No. But yet God uses imperfect people
mm-hmm.
to work his purposes. And I would say Donald Trump is the classic example of an imperfect person that God is, for whatever reason, this man has allowed God to move through him so where he sees stuff as it is and calls it what it is.
Yeah.
But he is, by far nowhere near perfect. But I say, neither are you. Okay, so.
Yeah. No, that's very, very true. Awesome.
That's what it comes down to, I think. Yeah.
All right. Well, we're almost out of time. I'm going to ask you one last question. This one's an easier one.
Oh, goody.
What book or couple books, have been most influential to you? Not just necessarily about what we've talked about, but just in life.
Over the course of my life?
Yeah.
Oh,
other than the Bible. I mean, obviously the Bible is...
Thank you. That's my go-to answer.
I just took it away from you, so...
All right. I do have to say, though, I love Eric Metaxas. And I have to say his book on Bonhoeffer, if I could remember what it's called, Bonhoeffer, Pastor, Martyr, Prophet, Spy. It came out in 2013, and it made a huge impact on me. I'm still not even sure why. Mm-hmm. He's brilliant, and it was very well written, and there had been bits and pieces of Bonhoeffer here and there and everywhere that people had written about, but he managed to consolidate all that information into one book in a brilliantly written book at the same time. So, that's 6-7 years ago, and I still, it's my go-to book, and which is why I ended up doing what I was, putting together this 9-part video series.
Yeah.
Boy, I'm trying to think of what this is a tough one. I would have to say Alfred, what's his name? Edersheim? Is it Alfred? I forget.
Yeah, Alfred Edersheim.
Alfred, yeah. Some of his stuff was, for example, the Temple, the ministry and service. That book, many, many years ago, had a real profound effect on me. And I think was instrumental in some ways in getting me going on the temple journey.
Nice.
And of course, I connected with Joe Good after that. I'm trying to remember. I think I read that book probably in the mid '80s. Also, now this is just on a purely fictional level. For those of you who know Bodhi Taney, Thone, who happens to be a good friend of mine, she wrote the Zion Chronicles and Zion Covenant back in the early '80s, and it was basically a historical fiction. Talked about, the backdrop of the founding of the state of Israel. But I just, those are the books where you stay up all night and read.
Yeah.
You get no sleep. And those books have always been, I reread them many years later, but I just love the way she's actually my inspiration for writing. And those books had a profound effect on me as well.
Yeah.
You caught me on this one. I haven't thought this through.
No, I really like that you added a fictional or creative fictional account, because a lot of times we discount things that are not true, supposedly not true.
Yeah.
But and this is one of the areas where we go wrong in the Bible, is that truth is, biblical truth is not something that is historically accurate. Biblical truth is something that tells you something true about reality.
Yeah, and it works no matter what.
Yeah, which is why parables are technically not historical truth. Even though I know there's some people who try to claim that. That's a very minority position, and but they speak a truth through a fictional story. And so, this has been something huge for me, is just, letting go of needing to, for example, the four gospels, making them all line up perfectly, or, how could this have historically happened in the Bible? To me, it doesn't matter, because the truth is not in the historical details. The truth is something telling me foundational about the way this world functions and the way that I interact with the living God. That's what truth is to me. So yeah, books like that can be so amazing.
Well, that's good, because really none of the stories in the Bible, none of the narratives, they're filled with holes. There's so much information missing. And, we sort of have the freedom, I guess, to kind of fill that in with our own imagination. But if it was to be historically accurate, then it should have, recorded every single detail of the history, instead of leaving these giant gaps for us.
Yeah.
And I would say, the parables, which really are Proverbs and the Psalms and all that sort of thing, is what, we've taught, and we'll have to do another show on this. But just that idea of wisdom literature and how wisdom operates, and how everything in the Bible, gives us the tools we need to make decisions today. Yeah. And I don't worry so much about the names, the places, the people, they're all historically accurate, but on purpose, they've left gaps for us. And that's because they've inserted something in there they want us to take away, a principle or a concept.
Yeah, exactly. And that's, and we, as 21st century human beings, we tend to focus in on going over the historical details, but the historical details aren't there for us to become history majors. They're there for us to learn something about how to live. Yeah.
and who God is and how he works.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
that's probably a good place to end.
Yeah. Scared off the people who weren't scared off by the beginning got scared off by that last little bit there. But I'd also reiterate what Dinah just said. We're not saying the Bible is historically inaccurate. We're just saying we get so focused in on that, on things that you can't prove historically accurate one way or the other, that we miss the story. Right. We miss what's going on there. So yeah.
All right. I think we ought to do a show really on the concept of wisdom in the Bible. I think that would, since that's the very nature of it, and that was that's very much kingship language. I think it would be sometime down the road here. I think it'd be really great to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to mark it down on my list here to do with you, and we'll get that knocked out here in season 2. Well, I mean, and I didn't tell you, I just started season 2, so we'll get it knocked out. Later on this season, which is, I don't know what a season is. Other people use seasons for podcasts, so it made me sound more professional.
Okay, well, hey, I'm happy to be number 1 in season 2.
So, all right. Well, thanks a lot for being on with me. And for those of you out there listening, if you're not already familiar, you can go to foundationsintorah.com and sign up for Dinah's amazing website. You can also go to bonhoefferdvd.com and get the DVD. It's amazing. And then what's the website for On Fire Prayer?
onfireprayer.com. Wow. How easy is that?
You just make it all easy.
Yeah, and bonhoefferdvd.com.
Yep. All right. Well, we'll see you again next time, friends. Again, I'm Ryan White, and for my website, if you want to check us out, faithofmessiah.com. We will see you for the next show. Shalom, everyone.
Hello.